gentlemen, I'm Sandy Quinn, President of the Richard Nixon Foundation, speaking to you live from the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and birthplace in Yorba Linda, California. Welcome to the East Room, where we are this evening, an exact replica of the one in the White House. Ladies and gentlemen, returning for the 12th time to the Richard Nixon Library, please welcome Callista Gingrich, accompanied by the Speaker, Newt Gingrich. Ladies and gentlemen, the Gingriches.
One thing I will give Sandy is that he knows how to have an entrance. Callista and I both want to apologize because we were on an airplane which was going to land with plenty of time, and then learned this morning that the airplane wasn't going to leave. And I do want to say a brief commercial for American Airlines. That was not their airplane, but they happened to have a plane. Instead of flying direct from Washington, they had a plane through Dallas. And they went overboard to get us here, make the connections. We had a barely legal connection in Dallas, and they did everything they could to be really helpful. In fact, our luggage didn't make the connection, so it's on the way here now. And then we just even had a few more complications. So we apologize for running late. And I particularly want to say to those of you who are in the reception earlier that we always enjoy having a chance to see you, and we apologize and hope we'll be able to at least get a picture or say something out front later on. Now, I don't think I quite realized it had been 12 times that we had been here. But it has always meant a lot to me to come here. The first presidential campaign I ever really got involved in as a volunteer was the Nixon Lodge campaign in 1960. And for those of you who may sometimes despair of Republicans in California, I might point out to you that in Georgia in 1960, the number of people who were willing to publicly campaign for Richard Nixon or for any Republican was a remarkably small number. We held no state legislative offices outside the mountains, and the seats we had in the mountains were a function of the Civil War. So if you just start with there, you can understand my whole career has been a series of climbing mountains. And that was one of the longest political nights of my life, listening as the Democrats stole Texas and Illinois in what was a remarkably close election. So I always come out here with a lot of different emotions, and I'm glad to be here tonight. And I'm going to talk about American exceptionalism really in 3 bites. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about what Callista's been doing, which is aimed at teaching 4 to 8-year-olds about American exceptionalism and about American history, something which we tragically find more and more of our young people are not learning in school, and so they need help learning it. Then I'm going to talk briefly about Lincoln and tomorrow's 150th anniversary of what may have been one of the most important speeches in American history, and in many ways one of the most important speeches in human history, because it described a standard that we should meet. And then I'm going to talk about Breakout, which in some ways is the culmination of my 55 years, going back to 1958, of trying to understand what we need to do as a country. And in 58, my dad, who was stationed in France, convinced me that somebody had to take responsibility for understanding what America had to do, for learning how to explain it so the American people would give you permission to do it, and then for knowing how to implement it if they gave you permission. And I think that that's a very important model. And Breakout is probably the most important book I've written because it's an effort to really recenter the system and to say to adults, just as Callista is saying to children, here's how we got to be an exceptional nation. Breakout is designed to say to adults, here's how we can continue to be an exceptional nation. And if you do read it and you do think it's important, I hope you'll use Facebook and Twitter and email addresses and what have you, and try to spread the word, because I think the more people we can get telling each other, the better off we're going to be, because the scale of this change I'm going to describe can only come from the grassroots up. It will never come from Sacramento. It'll never come from Washington. It's impossible to ask bureaucrats and politicians and lobbyists to get together to voluntarily disarm, and they're not going to do it. And so the only way you're going to get change on that scale is to run over them by arousing the American people to a point where they have no choice. And you saw a little bit of that this last week when 39 Democrats suddenly decided that Republican Congressman Fred Upton had a terrific idea. So, Callista and I were very fortunate. We did both a book and a movie about Ronald Reagan, and there's a great line where Reagan says that his real job was to show the light to the American people so they would turn up the heat on Congress. And I think maybe that's Breakout is in that tradition. If we get enough Americans to decide this is the right direction, they will eventually get their political figures to follow. Leadership is often a function of figuring out where the parade is going and trying to get in it, as opposed to actually leading it. So let me start with what Callista's been doing. Ellis the elephant is a time-traveling pachyderm who is, and he's not a Republican pachyderm. He is a 4 to 8 year old universal pachyderm. Okay, and we were at a Costco Saturday signing books, and if you had seen these little kids, we have somebody who plays Ellis. If you had seen these little kids running up to Ellis, you'd have understood exactly why she invented this character. But her goal has been first to talk about all of American history, and then to talk about the colonial period, and now in Yankee Doodle Dandy to talk about the American Revolution. And she's already beginning to work on a book for next year, which will be called From Sea to Shining Sea, in which Ellis helps Lewis and Clark go to the Pacific. And her goal is, and this is, by the way, very hard. Breakout is my 27th book. And I can tell you that watching her write the Ellis series, when you have to take facts, and we're in a small c sense conservative in that we actually want our history books to be factual, which is, I think, a very useful model. When you have to take a set of facts you think 4 to 8 year olds can understand, and then you have to describe them in rhyme, so it's easy for them to remember. And then with the help of her terrific artist, Susan Arciero, you've got to have a scene which explains what the rhyme is describing. Each of her page sections is the equivalent of one of my chapters in effort. I mean, it is, I didn't know this when she first started. I thought, oh, this would be great, write kids' books. Well, it turns out to be really important, but it's extraordinarily important that young Americans learn why we are, in fact, an exceptional nation. Now, it's interesting, and in fact, very appropriate to talk about Yankee Doodle Dandy for a second, because, of course, if you're going to describe the American Revolution, you are describing the Declaration of Independence. And what makes tomorrow's anniversary of Lincoln's speech so special is that it is at Gettysburg, in a 2-minute speech, that Lincoln really reunites the country with the Declaration of Independence. For most of our first 100 years or 80 years of our history, the Constitution had been the dominant document. It was the document which framed our law. It's the document which people looked at in terms of what does it mean to be an American and how are we going to structure this very complex country. Lincoln comes along, and Lincoln says, the Constitution defines the structure of who we are, but the Declaration of Independence describes the spirit of who we are. And I think it's peculiarly important in the current presidency, and I by the way, think it was entirely appropriate that President Obama did not go to Gettysburg, because I think that there's almost nothing in his current pattern which would be worthy of being near Abraham Lincoln. And I don't want to be partisan, but I do think it's very important to look in context. Lincoln was all about the rule of law. Lincoln understood, as somebody who had grown up very poor, who had only had about 1.5 years of schooling, who had literally learned how to read by the light of a fireplace because his family couldn't afford candles. And Lincoln understood that it is the rule of law which protects the weak. It is the rule of law which protects the average person. That without the rule of law, it is the predators, the vicious, and the powerful. And so he saw what we were fighting over as the very essence of freedom and whether or not freedom would survive. And he goes to Gettysburg. This war had gotten much longer, much bloodier, much more difficult than anybody expected. Everybody thought it was a 30 to 90-day war. And Lincoln is having to explain to the North, why is it worth this level of pain? Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the war, 3 days, an enormous number of casualties on both sides. And Lincoln is having to talk to people, and in virtually every village in America, there's a family who's lost somebody. And he's going to run for re-election. Now, nobody had been re-elected since Andrew Jackson. There's been a whole series of one-term presidents. Lincoln's going to run for re-election, having failed to win the war. And so he has if you go back and you read the Gettysburg Address as a campaign document, because he's having to reach out and appeal to people and basically say to them, do not let your son or your cousin or your nephew or your husband have died in vain. Don't flinch, don't back off, because this is central to the future of the human race. And he describes a very important thing, and this is what candidly has made the stunning, unending dishonesty of President Obama about, yes, you can keep your policy, which we now know he said at least 39 times, because we have it on videotape, at least 39 times. You can't have government of the people. And Lincoln's very clear with this. Supposedly, in talking with some of the great Lincoln experts, and I've written a novel on Gettysburg, and Calista spent time there, and she actually got dressed up in an 1860s outfit. And I got dressed up. I was a congressman. She was the congressman's wife. And then later she actually appeared in one of our other Civil War novels as a housewife whose house has become a hospital. She says some hostile things to the soldiers about having brought all these poor dying guys into her home. But we've spent a lot of time looking at Gettysburg and being at Gettysburg. And you have to understand that Lincoln apparently said, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And to him it meant the very heart of American exceptionalism, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's why if you can't have an honest debate and an honest conversation, if you can't have an executive officer who in fact you can believe in, you begin to undermine the whole system. And I think we are teetering right at the edge of a pattern of such unending lawlessness, of waiving laws, waiving rules, picking winners and losers, that is fundamentally antithetical to the entire American experience. And so I think it's worth every American tomorrow taking a minute to read the Gettysburg Address. And then hopefully that will lead them to go back and read the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. to be reminded, what does it mean to be an American? And it's in that context that I set out to write Breakout, because it struck me that we are mired down in Sacramento, and frankly, most of our city and county governments, in most of our school boards. And in Washington, D.C., we are mired down in such petty, destructive, negative politics, surrounded by campaigns of such unending viciousness and dishonesty, that the entire fabric of our system's at stake. And that we need to break out from this moment in American history. And what I found as I began to look around, and this is truly what makes this, to me, one of the most extraordinary periods in American history. Everywhere you go, there are hardworking, intelligent people who are pioneers of the future. And they're inventing things in energy, they're inventing things in transportation, they're inventing things in learning, they're inventing things in going into space, they're inventing things in being dramatically more effective. And you go around and you say, show me the most interesting things that are happening. Right here in California, Google has a self-driving car which has covered over 600,000 miles. Given the way we came down today, I'm not sure how many hours that took. In 600,000 miles, it has been in one accident. It was rear-ended by a human. Now, this is the beginning of a different world. I was at Peoria, Illinois, a couple months ago, and went by Caterpillar. And I stood next to the largest truck they build, which is a 40-ton truck. And they've now sold 24 of them as self-driving trucks to a mine in Western Australia, which is saving $1 million a year per truck. Because it goes down into the mine, gets filled up, goes up, drops the material off, goes back down into the mine. The truck does 24/7 minus maintenance and filling it up with diesel fuel. Different world. The Army's actually in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, working with a manufacturer to design Army trucks that would be self-driving, because then if you have an IED or a roadside bomb, you don't hurt anybody. And it's just one more effort to try to figure out how can we risk fewer Americans on the battlefield. But these things are coming down the road. On energy, of course, with the breakthrough in hydraulic fracturing and in horizontal drilling, you take a place like North Dakota, which went from 800 million barrels of reserve in 2002 to over 24 billion today, and rising. North Dakota has such a high employment rate. Wages have gone up 50% in the last 8 years. And McDonald's now pays a bonus if you will sign up to work. Now, that actually should be the conservative answer to income inequality. We would like everybody to rise up. We're not in the business of tearing down, but we should be in the business of helping every person rise up. And North Dakota is a pretty good case study. And if the federal government were actually encouraging it, we would be astonished how many additional jobs you'd be creating right now. We are this year the largest gas producer in the world. By 2015, we'll be the largest oil producer in the world. And that's an enormous shift of power away from Russia and the Middle East. And it increases our national security, but it also creates hundreds of thousands of new jobs. It lowers the price of energy. Natural gas today is 3 times as expensive in China as it is in the United States. And that just affects all of our manufacturing costs. And you just see all sorts of ripple effects that are pretty remarkable. There's a system called regenerative medicine, which is almost like science fiction. Regenerative medicine is when they take your cells and they grow a large number of them. And they then take 3D printing in the most recent version, and they print out the organ you need. So if you need a kidney, they can print out a kidney. If you need a heart, they can print out a heart. The Texas Regenerative Medicine Institute is headed by a woman doctor whose specialty is growing hearts. And you'll see in a few years, remember the young lady who had a hard time getting a lung transplant because she was too young and the bureaucratic rules didn't work? 10 years from now, if we're smart, if we encourage this, 10 years from now, there'll be no waiting lines. because you won't transplant. You will replant yourself. And it turns out you don't reject you. So the net effect, this is very important. What it means is you don't take any of those anti-rejection medicines. So you radically lower the cost, you dramatically increase the likelihood of success, you eliminate waiting lists. It's a different world. Number one problem, Food and Drug Administration. Now, virtually every regenerative scientist I talk to says they're almost certainly going to take their products to Singapore or China or Japan or India or Europe because the Food and Drug Administration is hopeless. It just gives you a sense of what we talk about is pioneers of the future, and then we talk about prison guards of the past. And imagine it was the 1840s and we had government in its modern form. The stagecoaches would hire lobbyists to pass a law to say that railroads could not go faster than a horse because it's an unfair competitive advantage. You may think I'm exaggerating. In the 1920s, the newspapers got Congress to pass a law that made it illegal to have radio news. It broke down in the 1930s, but there was a brief period when you could not legally have radio news because, you know, people protect their own self-interest. Very few people go out voluntarily, give up their interest for the greater good. And that's why you have this constant tension between pioneers of the future and the prison guards of the past. Now, one of the areas that's going to become the most fascinating is online learning. This is being streamed on YouTube, for example, tonight. Well, one of my favorite examples is right here in California. And again, when you talk about pioneers of the future, just as Henry Ford was amazing and Edison was amazing, the Wright brothers were amazing, there are people wandering around today who are amazing. One of them is a guy named Sebastian Thrun, T-H-R-U-N. Sebastian Thrun is German, but he's now an American because he wanted to come to an entrepreneurial, open society where you could really do exciting things that he thought you couldn't do in Germany. It was too stuffy, too conservative, too closed to new ideas. So he started working on artificial intelligence at Carnegie Mellon. He participated in the earliest experiments at building a self-driving car as a project that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency set up a prize. And the early cars didn't go very far. They were all in the Mojave Desert. They didn't go very far, and they weren't very reliable. They got better every single year. He then moved to Google, and he was the head of their self-driving car project. He then decided he would teach a course on advanced computing. And he and the vice president of research for Google announced that they were going to jointly teach a course at Stanford, and they were going to make it available online. They had 400 students in the classroom. They had 151,000 sign up. It drove the Stanford administration crazy because how do you regulate it? And how do you know they're getting a Stanford quality course? And why aren't they paying tuition? They had, I don't know the exact number, I think it was 43,000 completed the course. On the final exam, the highest rated student in the course in the Stanford class was number 441. That is, 440 people who were not in the class got a higher score on the final than the best student at Stanford in the class. And I saw Sebastian after this experiment was over, and he said it was very humbling. He said he'd always thought he was a great lecturer, and he'd always loved his lectures. And he suddenly discovered that if you took the online course, which was a problem-based course, you did better than if you spent the same amount of time listening to his lectures. Now, he then took from that and founded a firm called Udacity. It's the word audacity with the A gone. So Udacity is a firm, and this is a good example of a pioneer of the future. The stated goal of Udacity is to provide higher education for 90% reduction in cost. And so recently they announced at Georgia Tech that Udacity was now going to take a $70,000 residential master's degree in advanced computing, and they were going to offer the master's degree online for $7,000. Now, first of all, think about what that does to student loans. Second, if you're an adult and this is a class you really need, but you live in Minnesota or you live in Southern California and you're not going to move to Georgia Tech, you can now take it in the mornings, on the weekends, while you're on vacation. All of a sudden, we've begun to liberate you from the professor's schedule. Remember, most education is stunningly inefficient. The course will be offered at from 10:20 to 11:40 at the convenience of the professor, 3 days a week. Well, that's the world that's going to rapidly disappear despite every effort of the prison guards of the university system to block it. The most famous example, you can go look these things up yourself. I mean, I'm not making any of this stuff up. Go look up Duolingo, D-U-O-L-I-N-G-O. Duolingo is a free site that teaches 7 different languages. Now, it raises a very interesting question about the future of language education. It also raises a question about the ability to start teaching literacy on your smartphone so that nobody who's today illiterate has an excuse. We had a huge problem. I think in Detroit, the illiteracy rate's 47%. It's an enormous problem. And we're never going to get it fixed by having literacy teachers from 5 to 7, 2 nights a week. But you can start to think about whole new structures of learning. The most famous example of this is the Khan Academy. Khan is a financier who is doing very, very well. And he had some nephews who were not doing well in math. And so he began doing 6 to 8 minute YouTube videos explaining one math problem at a time. One of the things they discovered early on, very much like Sebastian Thrun, is that if he talked directly to them live, they learned less than if he taped a video and sent it to them, partially because of the pressure, partly because they could keep repeating until they got it, which you can't. It's very hard to ask a human being 3, 4, 5, 6 times. Because you get frustrated, they get frustrated, then you get embarrassed, then they get angry. But if it's taped, they don't care how often you watch it. This is also part of what Duolingo does. I've occasionally taken particular sections of Duolingo 8 times because I can't quite get it. And the computer never minds. It doesn't come back and say, boy, are you stupid. There are today at the Khan Academy 3,000 hours of material, and they get 10 million visitors a month. Now, I'm just suggesting to you, we're at the edge of breakthroughs. Very obvious example. Every state should adopt a law that says, if you need unemployment compensation, you have to sign up for online learning because we will pay to help you improve yourself. But think about it. This is a perfect example of what I mean by breakout. The morning you say, we are no longer going to subsidize bass fishing and deer hunting. If you can't get a job, we're not going to, and this is the difference between the old conservatism. The old conservatism said, well, why don't we just abolish it? Well, you're not going to abolish it. It's not plausible. You never get the votes. And in the process, you sound like you don't care what happens to these people. But if you say to them, you know, I do care about you. I care enough about you that I want you to actually acquire new skills so you can get a better job. It's also the answer to the crisis of the middle class. Unless you upgrade our skill level as a country, you're not going to upgrade our income level. Now, what I just did is I took $100 billion a year we've been throwing away, and I turned it into the largest adult job training program in American history, without spending any more of your money. I suspect, by the way, the morning you actually say they have to do something for it, you'll see a substantial drop in the number of people taking unemployment compensation. Because if they have to work, they might as well work. And I think, and that'll leave you with a significant change in attitude. But it all goes back to some core questions. The founding fathers all believed in work. If you look at Callista's books, when you look at the Land of the Pilgrim's Pride, which is about the colonial period, Captain John Smith, if you don't work, you won't eat. He didn't say that to the poor. He said it to the rich. They had paid their way over. He said to him, you can't make us work. After all, we've already paid for it. And he said, you're right, I can't make you work. So you don't have to work. But we don't have any extra margin. We're a brand new colony. So if you don't work, there won't be any food for you. But don't worry about it. You're right. Luckily, there weren't enough lawyers at that point for them to get an injunction against it. Just a small part of this. Now let me carry you just to one other area which, frankly, drives me nuts. And I've been on this now for almost 20 years. I will say, to frame this for a second, I am the only Speaker of the House in your lifetime to help create 4 consecutive balanced budgets. And I am adamant that we adopt a balanced budget as one of our goals. I think the national conversation for 2014 and 2016 should be very simple. It's essentially 3.5 topics. Is Obamacare the best we can do, or can we develop a breakout to a genuinely personal health system that uses all the modern capabilities we've got? That's number 1, because you can't avoid it. 2, is this economy the best we can do? Or can we get a breakout to the pioneers of the future, liberating us once again to be the most dynamic, full employment, high income society in the history of the world? 3, are we going to continue to steal from our children and grandchildren, or is it time to get to a balanced budget by fundamentally changing the government? And then the other issue, which I list as a half issue because it's not relevant right now every day, but it could bite us at any time, and that is the current policy of weakness, confusion, really a very reliable national security policy, or is the world dangerous, and do we need a much more coherent foreign and national security policy? That's not on the front burner right now. Unfortunately, the nature of the world, as you remember on 9/11, that can get on the front burner every morning. But notice I didn't say it should be the Republican campaigns. That should be our national conversation. We should say to every Democrat, every Republican, every independent, every libertarian, every socialist, I mean, this is really the best you think America can do? Now, let me put it in context. Now, and you'll see why I sometimes grow impatient with my friends in Washington. Recently, the Internal Revenue Service announced that it had sent $4 billion last year to crooks. These are in refunds. This is your refund for your taxes. Now, when I say crooks, they sent 585 checks to one address in Singapore. They sent over 850 checks to one address in Lithuania. Now, at one level, you have to ask yourself how you ended up with a government so mindless and so incompetent that it could do this. I mean, $4 billion isn't big money, but if you had to choose between giving it away to crooks in Lithuania and Singapore or spending it at the National Institute of Health on research, I would argue that it would probably be dramatically better to have spent it on research. It's just, and I know this is a bold, outside the box, unfair, you know. But what drives me crazy about the Congress is, to the best of my knowledge, there's no serious effort to think this stuff through. And I'm writing a paper right now on what I'm going to call foresight hearings. And here's the difference. Oversight hearings are when a group of congressmen get together, senators or House members, and they pontificate for the opening hour, this is really bad, I can't believe how bad this is, and I'm really embarrassed that this is so bad. Then the bureaucrats come in, and the bureaucrats all say, well, this is really not quite as bad as it seems, but it is pretty bad, and we feel really bad about how bad it is. And we want you to know that we take full responsibility for how bad it is, which has no meaning because we all have lifetime jobs. But we are happy for you to beat up on us for a while if it means you feel better, and we can then go back to continuing to do whatever it was we were doing that was totally stupid before we came down here, because nothing's going to change anyway. And then the congressmen all say, well, this has been a highly meaningful hearing, and I'm confident. I mean, isn't this what you've watched for most of your life? So here's how a foresight hearing would go. You'd spend the first part of it describing what you're trying to accomplish. You know, for example, an IRS system whose refund accuracy level is comparable to American Express, Visa, or MasterCard. Not an outside-the-box goal. I mean, these are three institutions that are alive. You can measure them. Then the second part of the hearing, you'd actually bring in people who do it well. And I would list those three companies, for example, the people who run security worldwide for automatic teller machines. I mean, you know, I always tell people, one of the great virtues of McDonald's and similar institutions is a trainer of very young people. One of the reasons liberals were just crazy to attack working at McDonald's is it's the first time young kids encounter the idea that the accuracy you have to have on your cash register is higher than 70%. That 70% may be passing in school because it has no meaning in the real world. But in the real world, they actually would like you to be like, say, 100%. Now, I mean, this is an enormous shock, and it's become a bigger shock the worse our schools have gotten. Because all of a sudden, these little kids are going, you mean, every day? You mean the change has to be accurate for every customer? I mean, won't you cut some slack? I mean, what if I only can do 9 out of 10? I mean, I'm sincere. Don't you like me? And this is kind of the problem you have with the federal government is we know how to solve this. But you solve it by replacing the current bureaucratic structure, not by reforming it. This is a 130-year-old model that doesn't work anymore. May never have worked, but certainly doesn't work now. And it's a model based on paper. So you have all of these nice bureaucrats sitting around with their paper, while all the crooks are sitting around with iPads. You have the second great virtue, that the crooks work after 5. I mean, I first learned that from my best friend in high school, who was a very, very successful tax lawyer. And I said, what's the key to what you do? He said, I work later. He said, the IRS will issue a rule. And it's a fairly lengthy process to issue a rule. And by the time they have had the comment period and they have finalized the rule, I will have found a new loophole for my client to get around the rule. Because I'll stay late enough at night that I will presently figure it out, and they will then take them 3 years to discover the new loophole that I've already found. And by the time they issue the new rule, I will have found a new loophole. And he said, I make a lot of money because, you know, my client thinks this is cool. Almost every American corporation believes not paying the federal government is a good thing. And frankly, almost every American believes not paying the federal government. I've had very few people rush in and say, I feel so bad. Could I give them more? So the second phase would be to actually bring in people who do it well. The third phase would be, in a very calm way, to bring in the people currently in charge and just say, explain the system. This is a systems problem. This is something I learned from taking a tutorial from Edwards Deming, the father of the quality movement. This is not about bad people. These are decent people in a terrible system. And so you ought to say, tell me what the system is. And then you ought to bring in experts who could say, all right, here is a system that works and here is a system that fails. And if you really want to get to the system that works, it means you have to have these changes. And then, frankly, I think it would be very healthy for the country if the last phase of these kind of hearings would be the members actually talking among themselves in public and saying, all right, given what we've now learned, what do we think the systems changes ought to be? And this is endemic. You know, the president the other day, to his credit, began to explain, I don't think he understood the implications, but he began to explain that, you know, his campaign could be really effective because they weren't in the federal government. I mean, if you haven't read this, this is the most interesting thing that Obama has said at a philosophical level in terms of its long. I mean, the most interesting thing he said, period, was he had never realized that buying insurance was hard. And I said at the time, if you're 52 years old and you are just now learning that buying insurance is complicated, maybe you shouldn't have tried to redo the entire country. he actually said two other things. This one press conference, when he was clearly totally rattled, and it's almost painful. The Washington Post put up 6 pictures of him on the front page the next day with different images of, sort of between defeat, dismay, disillusion, whatever the other words were. He said two other things at a personal level that were just fascinating. One was he also said, gee, he hadn't realized that it would be more complicated to buy health insurance than it is to go in Kayak or eBay or Amazon. The founders of Google supported him. The founders of Facebook supported him. I mean, the idea that he didn't bring in a bunch of these guys sometime 2 or 3 years ago and say, hi guys, how hard do you think it'll be to design a highly complex system nationwide for 315 million people, which requires them to give you all their personal information so we can then have a calculator to tell them what their subsidy is so they never actually know the real cost because they'd be really mad. Apparently nobody who was competent ever wandered in and said, what you're trying to do, because what he's trying to do is much harder than Amazon. And it's not a fair comparison. And then the last piece was when he said that he really did believe, up to the last week, that it was going to work. Which leads you to 2 possibilities. I mean, A, if he is that out of touch with reality about the largest single domestic project, what do you think he understands about Iran? Or North Korea? And B, if this thing is as big a mess as it seems to be, how come no one has been fired? I mean, if you want to talk about institutionalizing incompetence, it is having people fail on a grand scale and keeping them. Because it sends a signal to everybody else that there are no standards that matter. What matters is friendship and favoritism. And this is an enormous, enormous problem. But the strategically bigger thing he said, and he goes on about 3 or 4 sentences on it. He says, setting up an IT program for the campaign was easy because we didn't have all these federal regulations. And then he goes on at length about the federal regulations. Well, this raises, and I, by the way, I happen to agree with him. And I told one of his assistants a couple weeks ago that this is actually a great excuse to look at all the federal procurement regulations, because if you look at the F-35 cost overruns, they are as big a scandal as Obamacare, but they don't get the same level of coverage. But we have a Defense Department today which has got to have a minimum of $200 billion a year of institutionalized waste. And it's just true across the whole system. In every place you turn in the federal government, our estimate is in Medicare and Medicaid, we have between $70 and $110 billion paid to crooks every year. I mean, this begins to be real money on a big scale. And it also sickens the whole system. Because you look around and you say, I could be an honest doctor or I could be rich. Gee, I think I'll just rip off the government for a few months. It's really dangerous to the very fabric of our society. But there's a secondary part, which nobody was fast enough to ask him, but which will be coming up over and over. And I should mention in passing brief commercial, I will certainly be raising it on Crossfire for any of you who'd like to watch. It's on CNN. We're at 6:30 Eastern Time, 5 nights a week. But here's the question, which I want to ask all of his supporters every time they come on board. If the federal government procurement system is such a total mess that you couldn't get a website right, why would you think you could run the health system? Because it's vastly more complex. The website's easy. But deciding which person gets a kidney transplant, deciding who gets the right cancer treatment, I mean, these are not decisions you want made in Washington, D.C. by people who can't even get a website on. And I think it may turn out in the long run that Obama may be one of the great trainers of conservatism in American history. We may have a generation that... But I'm going to close this and then I think I'm allowed to take questions unless somebody tells me I can't. So I'm going to close this and take questions. I want you to understand how deeply I feel this. If all we do is be negative, if all we do is take advantage of every mistake they make, we will have totally failed to serve the country. The fact is, You need a positive model of Breakout to replace the prison guards. You need a vision of a dramatically better future to organize our energies and to arouse our excitement and to get us moving forward again. And we have to have a conservative movement which is dedicated to knitting together all of the pioneers of the future, dedicated to developing an extraordinarily exciting sense of an American future, and dedicated to actually building a program so when we win, we know what we're doing. I mean, I am tired of personality-oriented campaigns dominated by negative attack ads whose net result is nothing positive happens for America. And I wrote Breakout as a starting point to have a conversation for the next few years to say to people, when you run into a politician, ask them what they're for. Don't ask them to tell you what they're against. They don't like Obamacare, which I don't, fine. What's the replacement? They don't like the current deficit spending, fine. How are you going to get to a balanced budget? They don't like the current economy? What are you going to do to get us to grow at the 5 or 6% we ought to be growing at right now? I mean, coming out of this deeper recession, we ought to be growing 5 or 6% a year. We ought to be pulling people back into the middle class. We ought to be solving a lot of our problems by just the sheer dynamics of a recovery. We're getting none of that right now. So don't just tell me what you're against, tell me what you're for. And I've been through all too many campaigns in the last 15 years that have been negative, petty, personality-oriented, and I think they don't serve the country well, and I don't think we're going to solve our problems with that approach. So I hope you will read Breakout if you agree with me that it's really an important concept, and that if we could get people to think about pioneers of the future and think about prison guards of the past, we could really begin a dialogue that is future past and is very powerful in terms of bringing many people together who wouldn't normally think they were on the same side. And I'd appreciate if you decide that's true, if you let all your friends and neighbors and your Facebook associates and so forth know that you feel that way. So I think if am I allowed to take questions?
We're going to do a few questions. Yes, sir. And I have a microphone, so if you will raise your hand, I will bring you the microphone. And we'll start with this young lady right here. If you'll stand and state your name and ask your question.
Hello, my name is Danielle. I'm with the Chapman Republicans, and our question kind of as a whole group is, how do you get students to stop paying attention to liberal ideas which kind of just feel good and sound good and start listening to real issues and doing what's best for the country instead of just what makes them feel good about themselves?
Thank you.
It's a good question. I think there are two parts to it. One is what Margaret Thatcher said, that first you have to win the argument, then you win the vote. So I think you got to think about, you're very important. I mean, what I'm going to say to a lot of liberals, because it's so patently true across the board, is, you know, they might have been great ideas. They don't work. So I would partly say to them, gee, go look at the poorest neighborhoods in Southern California. You think government's worked? Tell me about your job prospects compared to your parents at your age. Tell me about your student loans. You know, tell me, you know, the Obama people always say, boy, you now get to stay on your parents' insurance till you're 26. My answer is, I'd like you to have a job so you could have your own insurance before you're 26.
Mr. Speaker, my name's Tom Adams from Placentia. Who do you feel that we have in government right now that could champion such an action that you're trying to promote?
Oh, I think there are a lot of pretty smart people. I mean, first of all, I think there are some governors who are doing very interesting things. If you look at Governor Scott Walker, for example, he has really had a big impact. If you look at Governor Rick Perry, I mean, Texas creates routinely more jobs than about 25 other states combined, and has done so unendingly, and it's not been an accident. If you look at John Kasich, who's really turned Ohio around, you look at Bobby Jindal, who has the widest school choice program in the country. I mean, there are a lot of interesting governors out there, and candidly, although some conservatives aren't necessarily in love with him, but Chris Christie deserves a lot of credit. He took on a very blue state, and he really has changed a lot about Trenton in a way that's very impressive, and I think we ought to start from there. I think when I work with specific people in Congress, there are a lot of different folks. In the last couple of days, I've been talking, for example, with Rob Portman, who knows a lot about the IRS. Ron Johnson, who is a manufacturer who's elected to the Senate in Wisconsin, would be a good example. Mike Burgess, who's a medical doctor who serves in the U.S. House, carries around he has a cell phone or a smartphone, but his smartphone has an app that does cardiology. So he can literally put it up to you, and you're getting an electrocardiogram on his smartphone, and he sort of gets where we're going and what we're trying to accomplish. Tim Griffin, who's a great congressman from Arkansas, clearly knows the general direction we're trying to go in. So there are glimmerings. There's enough to be hopeful about.
Mr. Speaker, we are taking questions from YouTube. We've been online all week, so we have some that people have emailed in, and we'll start now with the first one. And because you can't see the screens, I'll read it to you. How would you rate President Obama's foreign policy compared to that of Richard Nixon? This is from Kevin Jacobson in Redlands.
I don't know. Look, without getting myself in too much trouble, you'll be like, how would you compare a bunny rabbit and a German shepherd? I mean, I really do worry for the country for the next 3 years, because if you watch the Syrian fiasco, you watch what's happening in Libya. There were 300 people killed in Iraq last week. You look at what's happening in Egypt. You look at what's happening around the world. You look at North Korea. The person who negotiated the North Korean agreement so that the North Koreans would not get a nuclear weapon, of which they've exploded 3 since the agreement, is the person who is helping organize the Iranian project. I mean, you talk about learning nothing. So I'm very concerned. I think Obama has a fantasy view of the world, reinforced by an inability to listen, and with people around him who are at least as out of touch with reality as he is. I think that's really dangerous. And I think that we have been very lucky up till now. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. The relative importance of the United States in the world today is dramatically smaller than it was the day he took office. And every day that he's in office, it's going to keep declining, because foreign leaders are taking their mark of him, and they don't find much there.
Mr. Speaker, in the back of the room, a contractor from Laguna Hills.
Hi, I'm Jim Sharp. I have a two-part question. One is, are you going to run for President of the United States?
I don't know.
Second part. Second part is, what would you do about job creation?
Well, I mean, look, this is not complicated. We have done this over and over in our history. The first thing you do is you favor job creators. That means and by the way, this is as big a problem for California as anywhere in the country. It means less red tape, less regulation. I'd like to see the Small Business Committee holding hearings on how many things do small businesses have to fill out that are utterly, totally unnecessary, and just abolish them. I mean, I think we need to go through a period of liberating people and making it exciting to be in business, exciting to go out and create jobs. And we frankly need somebody who has the courage to defend business and to defend free enterprise. And as Margaret Thatcher once said, if somebody doesn't earn it, you can't take it away from them and spend it. So the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money to spend. And I think we need to have somebody who says, we know how to create jobs. We've been very good at it historically. But you don't do it by having another government agency invest billions of dollars in fantasy industries that go bankrupt. I mean, that's a misallocation of resources. And by the way, it's a misallocation of talent. It means you're taking hundreds and hundreds of smart people and encourage them to go off down a trail that's going to collapse and waste 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of their life doing something that has no future. And that's why, frankly, the government, there are many things government can do well. I am very big for government doing basic research, and I think it has a huge impact with basic research. But trying to pretend that government can be a venture capitalist is an absolute guaranteed way to go broke.
Mr. Speaker, to your right, I'm going to go to the screen for another question. This one is from Julia Winters of Mesa, Arizona. Who are the prison guards of American society today?
Well, the primary, it's a good question. The primary prison guards are interest groups, lobbyists, and bureaucracies. And then to some extent politicians. I mean, for example, in the space program, one of the major impediments is that both Republican and Democratic members of Congress see the space program as pork barrel rather than as adventure. So they will defend the company or the government agency in their district or their state, even if it's no longer competent, because it's jobs. And this has been a major problem for NASA, which is basically now just a milk cow for politicians to waste money, as opposed to being a bold and dynamic and adventurous thing. So I think you could almost go to city government, county government, state government, and the federal government and say, who is blocking the future? Who is blocking competition? And by the way, when Obamacare collapses, which I'm fairly certain it will, the great fight on the left's not going to have a fight. The left wants single payer. They've learned nothing. They think Britain and Canada work, even though the Canadian Prime Minister of Newfoundland recently went to Florida for an operation that they couldn't get in Canada. And the former head of the National Health Service in Great Britain died after their operation had been postponed 4 times. But that doesn't matter if you're a genuine socialist. Just think, look, there are occasional casualties in the way to perfection, and what the heck. The real fight's going to be on the right, and it's going to be between the prison guard faction of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, who are going to say, oh, insurance, I hate government bureaucrats, but boy, insurance bureaucrats are terrific. And it's going to be, and those of us who believe, no, you want to break out, excuse me, to a genuinely personal health system. A fundamentally different model than just going back to the old order. This will be the big fight. And you'll then find out who prison guards are. And there's a good example. There's a little firm in Silicon Valley, which I always get wrong, so Chris will tell me later. I think it's pronounced as Theranos, and Theranos. Founded by a young woman who was a sophomore at Stanford, dropped out, took her education trust fund, put it into starting a company. They've spent 10 years designing a micro testing system. So they take just a tiny amount of your blood. All of you have been to the doctor and had them draw lots of blood. They take a tiny amount of your blood. They can run 1,000 different tests. They do it for 50% of the current cost. Their estimate is it saves Medicare and Medicaid combined, I think it's $157 billion over 10 years. But now think to yourself, you want to see prison guards emerge? Every hospital that has its own lab, every national laboratory corporation, you think they want to drop their prices 50%? You think they want to have to invest in new technology? And so every time you turn around, you'll find there are plenty of prison guards around. And the key is for us to develop a more and more exciting future and gradually just overrun. I mean, nobody voluntarily said to McDonald's and to Walmart, we'd like to go out of business. They just had to win the fight for customers.
Mr. Speaker, a clothing designer from Huntington Beach.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Speaker. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it, I'm sure. Everybody can agree with that. My question for you is, as millions more Americans continue to lose their health care coverage because of Obamacare, what do you foresee the ramifications of that being in the 2014 elections and then the 2016 elections as well?
Oh, I suspect that there will, it's a great question. I suspect there will be a very bold attempt sometime next spring to fundamentally start dismantling Obamacare, and that about half the Democrats will be involved in the dismantling. I don't think when people realize, by the way, that the number who may get letters next October is 93 million. So you've seen the amount of pain out of 5 million? Well, the best estimate we have right now from the government itself is 93 million. Now, if you're a Democrat up for re-election, you think to yourself, October, Gee, I wonder how that will affect their vote in November. And I think as that sinks in January, February, you may see some very bold and very dramatic fights. And it'll be interesting to see whether Obama basically takes the position that he would rather wreck his own party trying to defend Obamacare, or whether he will in fact decide that he has no choice except to become flexible in fixing it, because it is so clearly not going to work.
All right, one more from the right side here, a gentleman from Palm Springs.
My name is Don. My question to you, Mr. Speaker, is this. What do you think of Mark Levin's constitutional convention that he's calling for by the states to solve many of the problems of which you spoke to earlier this evening, as changing our Constitution to deal with those inequities?
Thank you.
I'd be much more interested in if Mark would explain to me who he thinks is going to get elected to that convention. I mean, if you look at the last two elections, you'd have to assume the convention would be in fact dominated by people who supported Obama. I'm not sure that's a constitutional convention I particularly want to be part of. So I'm very cautious about putting the whole thing up for bid. Second, even if you could elect your own folks, the people who spent 55 days in Philadelphia writing the original document were among the most extraordinary people ever to try to shape human history. The idea that we're going to somehow cleverly match that strikes me as not very clever, because all of them had been involved in writing constitutions for a decade. I mean, they'd all written colonial and then state constitutions. They'd written the Articles of Confederation. These guys had all been thinking about this a lot. We have nobody today, not a single person, who has that depth of understanding of practical self-government that those people had.
Another online question. This one is, we know that the heavily bureaucratic Obamacare is asking for negative consequences if given the opportunity to formulate health care policy. How do you propose we approach American health care, the American health care debacle? From Jeremy Evans from Boston, Massachusetts.
Well, first of all, let me say I'm impressed with your reach in terms of the different places people write you from. I actually, on the way out today, was writing a paper on this very topic, which starts with an assumption that Obamacare is going to collapse, and that the real fight will be between single payer and then the right splitting between the old order and the effort to create a new order. So I'm going to just talk for a minute or two about the new order. I will tell all of you, if you're interested, that you can go to gingrichproductions.com and sign up. And we send out at least 2 newsletters a week for free. And we also let you know when other things are published about this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in public policy, gingrichproductions.com is where Clist and I are based. I'm going to give you just 3 core principles for how I think we should approach fundamentally rethinking this, and I'll let you apply it to your own life. The first is, it should be built from the individual back, not from the larger system down. How do we, I'll give you 2 examples. You absolutely, and we're trying to write a health bill of rights right now for Americans. You absolutely should have the right to know, to have your own medical record. You should have the right to know price and quality. Virtually none of the insurance companies will tell you price and quality. None of the labs, by the way, will tell you what they charge. They're all contracted. None of the medical device companies who are really upset about this tax, none of them want to tell you what the price of their equipment is. So if you went into a hospital for a hip replacement and you had 5 different options, you wouldn't have any idea which one works better or which one costs more. Now you can't, and I always tell people this, you can't have a market if there's no price and quality information. So I want to empower you to play a major role in your health, which means you'll inevitably deal with your doctor, you'll inevitably deal with your dentist, you'll inevitably deal with your pharmacist. And in an ideal world, you wouldn't have this current pattern where the insurance company creates a narrow network and you find out that the person who took care of you for the last 3 years is no longer in the network, but now you're going to go to somebody you've never met before. And the whole process becomes very depersonalized, which actually in the long run I think is bad medicine, because doctors and nurses and pharmacists have to be able to deal with the entire person. So my first point would be, you want it to be built around you. My second point is, we ought to start with the information technology that now exists. I mean, the very fact, Dr. Topol down in San Diego wrote a book on this. You know, and he had invented some device, and he was at NBC one night, and it was, again, it was on a smartphone. He turned and he put it up to the chest of a patient, read in real time what it said, and then said to the reporter, last year that was an $800 test. Like that. Well, what if you designed the system to maximize the flow of information and to maximize the ease and convenience? Now, this is where you start getting into all sorts of prison guard problems. Because you want to start saying, for example, everybody could have their own EKG on their cell phone if they wanted to. This will drive your doctor crazy. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't be allowed to do it. Finally, you want to maximize the rate of innovation, not minimize it. Now, the two areas I focus on are regenerative medicine, which, for example, if we could replace your kidney instead of putting you on kidney dialysis, the quality of your life goes up, your ability to stay at work goes up, therefore you stay up, you're still a taxpayer, and in the process, you just lead a lot better independent life. And so regenerative medicine is a big deal. The other really big deal, which is very hard to get through in Washington, is brain research. You take autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, mental health, you go down a whole list. If we can make the kind of breakthroughs that are possible in the next 10 to 15 years, we will save trillions of dollars. And we'll save millions of people from agony. And you just can't get this across. And so you end up spending a tiny amount this year, even though you know in the budget that you're just going to be crushed by the out years. So build it around the person and their doctor and their pharmacist and dentist. Build it around information technology that's current and future technology, and maximize the rate of innovation, because that's what's going to save the most lives and the most money, and is also, by the way, going to create the highest value American jobs. Somebody asked about job creation. If you had 80% of the world's breakthroughs in health in the next 30 years in the United States, you'd have more high-value jobs than you could imagine, because as the whole planet gets richer, they all want to live longer. And so health is both a cost, but it's also an enormous opportunity for high-income jobs.
Mr. Speaker, we're going to do one more question so we can go to the book signing. A gentleman from Tehachapi.
Hi, Mr. Speaker. A two-part question on the finances and the economy. Under President Washington's administration, Hamilton brought us from a huge war debt to on our way to becoming a world-class economy. Not quite the policies we're seeing today. What can we learn from what Hamilton did right? And the second part, the housing market crash as compared to the crash of '29, both of those led to big government influence and the people looking to them for hope. What can we learn from the causes of both of those and be proactive and kind of prevent those things from happening again to prevent people from expecting big government?
Well, look, you raised a very important and in some ways very sophisticated question. Let me start by saying I believe the Federal Reserve should be audited annually. I think that this... You cannot have a public official with the scale of power the chairman or chairwoman of the Fed has and have no accountability. This is a very dangerous model. And it's a model that invites cronyism, and it's a model that invites behaviors that are really destructive. Second, I personally believe the only job of the Federal Reserve should be stable money. I think we are gambling on creating a bubble of unbelievable proportions. This whole model by which they have been floating more and more and more paper. You know, at one point Bernanke said if he had to, he'd get in a helicopter and throw money out just to make sure there was enough money. I think that is a remarkably one-sided and frankly wrong image of what the Great Depression was all about. I think that they are running enormous dangers of creating a crisis of too much money. The only reason inflation hasn't gone up is that the economy is so weak. Just a brief side note. Inflation essentially is two things. It's the volume of money multiplied by the speed of money. So it's quantity times velocity. So if you have lots and lots of money, but nobody's spending it, the net of the two multiplied is pretty small. The morning you start seeing the economy improve, you watch. You're going to see inflation go through the roof. We have never had this much paper just sitting out there floating. It also allows you to avoid solving all your big problems. It's like a family that's suddenly given a huge unlimited credit card and told, hey, nothing's due for 10 years. Well, it's pretty hard to turn to the kids and say, no, we're not going to go to Disneyland because we can't afford it. And so we haven't dealt with any of our underlying structural problems. We're nowhere close to dealing with a balanced budget. And yet, what Hamilton did, which is actually, if you read the first report on manufacturers and the first report on the debt, he did two things. He created a tax code designed to maximize American manufacturing. And he insisted that we honor our debt and that we pay for it and that we do so in hard money. And this was a deliberate design to get the world to trust us. And we are very close, and I'll be very intrigued to see how the new chairwoman does, because she is ostensibly very much on the pro-inflation, pro-soft money side. And so it'll be interesting to see what the next 3 or 4 years are like. But I do not like the Federal Reserve being this powerful. I do not like it being this secretive. I think it is a very grave danger to the entire fabric of our society. And we need to have a very serious, significant reforms of the system. Let me just say, once again, Sandy, you guys are brilliant. You do a terrific job here. Clifton and I are both looking forward to meeting people and signing books. And we always seem to have such a great time when we come here. And we thank all of you for coming out tonight.
We're going to take you out back through there. Ladies and gentlemen, He's been here 12 times, but we want him back 12 more. And to help give him an incentive for coming back, yes, I'm presenting this one-of-a-kind, numbered, limited edition, limited to the number we can sell in the gift shop. What would Nixon do mug?
Thank you.
Thank you. You just go right out there and away you go.